drift off to sleep. I'm your host, Emily. Tonight's story is called An Amish Mother's Diary, A Year of Simple Living. Get comfy, settle down, and let this story help drift you off to sleep. March 15th, 1st, signs of spring. The frost has finally begun to leave the fields. I noticed it first this morning, just after dawn, when the sunlight stretched across the rows of bare earth, glistening with the last traces of ice. Jakob was already out by then, checking the fences and clearing away the fallen branches from the winter storms. He left early, just after breakfast, with a nod and his hat pulled low. I woke the children just before 6. Mary was the first to stir, her hair a wild tangle as she rubbed her eyes and sat up in bed. Isaac followed soon after, stretching and blinking in the pale morning light. I set out their clothes the night before. Simple dresses for Mary and Ruth, sturdy trousers and shirts for Isaac and Samuel. By the time they were dressed, the kettle was whistling on the stove. Breakfast was plain. Oatmeal with a bit of honey and fresh bread I baked yesterday. The children ate quietly, their heads bowed, hands folded in prayer before each bite. It's good to start the day with silence and gratitude. It reminds us of the blessings we have, even in the smallness of our lives. After breakfast, we set to work. The kitchen needed tidying, the floors swept and the stove polished. I showed Mary how to fold the linens properly, her small hands moving carefully over the edges, smoothing them out with gentle precision. Isaac and Samuel carried the firewood from the shed to the back porch, stacking it neatly along the wall. They grumbled a bit, but I saw their smiles when I brought out fresh slices of apple for them as a reward. By mid-morning, the sun had risen high enough to warm the earth, and I took Ruth out to the garden. She is still small, only 4, but her hands are quick and eager. Together we pulled away the dead leaves that had gathered around the base of the lilac bushes, the soil beneath damp and rich. I showed her how to press the seeds into the earth, her tiny fingers pressing gently, patting the soil back into place. March 20th, planting season begins. Jakob hitched up the plough this morning, the leather straps creaking softly in the cold air. The horses snorted and stamped their feet, anxious to move. I watched from the porch as he led them out to the field, their hooves heavy against the frost-bitten ground. Planting season has begun, and with it, the long days of work that stretch out before us. The children helped me with the early planting. Peas and onions first, their seeds tucked into the earth in even rows. Mary was careful, her hands steady as she pressed the seeds into the soil. Isaac moved a bit faster, his movements hurried but enthusiastic. I reminded him gently to take his time, and he nodded, slowing his pace with a shy smile. We broke for lunch just after noon. I made soup, simple and warm, and we ate it together at the long wooden table. Jakob came in, brushing the dirt from his boots, his hands rough and calloused. He ate quietly, nodding his thanks as I poured him another cup of coffee. His hands are tired, but his eyes are bright. April 5th, spring rains and washing day. The rains came heavy last night, pattering against the windows and pooling along the edge of the barn. I woke to the smell of damp earth and fresh rain, the air cool and sharp. Today is washing day, and the rain is both a blessing and a challenge. Mary helped me with the linens, her hands quick and sure as she pulled the wet sheets from the basin. I wrung them out, twisting the fabric until the water poured from it, splattering against the stones. We on the line in neat rows, the wind catching at the corners and snapping them gently. Mary laughed when the breeze blew them back into her face, her hair whipping around her shoulders. Inside, the bread was rising, the dough plump and soft beneath the damp cloth. I checked it once before returning to the chores, sweeping, scrubbing, mending the edges of Isaac's trousers where he caught them on the fence last week. It is never ending, this work, but there is comfort in the rhythm of it. April 12th. The garden takes shape. The sun has stretched a little higher each morning, warming the earth and drawing thin tendrils of green from the soil. This morning, after breakfast, I took Mary and Ruth to the garden to check on the seedlings we planted last month. The peas have sprouted, their tiny leaves bright against the dark soil. Mary knelt beside them, her fingers brushing the delicate stems as if afraid to disturb them. "Will they be ready soon?" she asked, her voice soft. "In time," I replied. "Everything grows when it is ready." We spent the morning tending to the garden. I showed Ruth how to water the seedlings properly, not too much, just enough to settle the soil. She held the tin watering can with both hands, her little arms straining but determined. Mary raked the rows, her movements slow and careful. When we finished, I stood back to look at the neat lines of green stretching across the plot. There is something hopeful in it. The promise of growth, the steady patience of the earth. April 25th. The first community gathering. Yesterday was the first community gathering of the year. After the long winter months, it is always a blessing to see familiar faces again, cheeks flushed from the morning chill, hands extended in greeting. The men gathered around the barn, discussing the planting season, while we women set out long wooden tables covered with linen cloths. There were loaves of fresh bread, still warm and soft, jars of apple preserves, and plates of cheese wrapped neatly in wax paper. The children played near the edge of the field, their laughter bright against the grey morning sky. I spent most of the afternoon with Anna Miller, my closest friend. We sat near the window, our hands busy with needlework, as we spoke of the coming summer. She has 3 children now, the youngest still toddling about at her feet. I watched as she smoothed his hair, her fingers gentle and practiced. As the sun began to set, Jacob came to fetch me. His hands were still rough with dirt from the fields, but his eyes were bright. "The planting's going well," he said quietly as we walked back to the wagon. I nodded, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence beside me. May 3rd, preparing the fields. The days have grown warmer, stretching longer into the evening. Jacob hitched the horses before dawn, their breath visible in the cool morning air. I watched from the kitchen window as he led them out to the field, their hooves heavy against the damp earth. He ploughed until midday, the soil turning dark and rich behind him. I spent the morning washing linens with Mary. She is getting stronger, able to lift the wet sheets from the tub without much help now. We wrung them out, our hands red from the cold water, before carrying them to the line. The wind caught at the corners, snapping them gently back and forth. In the afternoon, I baked 2 loaves of bread and set a stew to simmer on the stove. The kitchen filled with the smell of herbs and yeast, and I cracked the window just slightly to let the steam escape. Outside, I could hear Isaac and Samuel stacking firewood for next winter, their voices soft and steady as they worked. May 14, Sewing Circle. Today was the first sewing circle of the year. I always look forward to these afternoons, the quiet hum of conversation, the rhythmic pull of needle and thread. The women gathered at Anna's house this time. Her kitchen was warm, the stove crackling with fresh logs. We worked on a quilt for Miriam Fisher's daughter, who is to be married in August. The fabric was soft and well chosen, squares of pale blue and cream, stitched carefully together. I watched Anna as she worked, her hands quick and steady, her needle flashing in the lamplight. We spoke of the garden, of the children, of the community. There is comfort in the smallness of it, the gentle familiarity of voices I have known all my life. We worked until the light began to fade, folding the quilt neatly and setting it aside for the next gathering. Anna sent me home with a jar of strawberry preserves, still sealed and warm from the canning. May 29th, the first harvest. The first of the lettuce and radishes were ready this week. I rose early, just before dawn, and pulled on my shawl before heading out to the garden. The air was cool, the grass still wet with dew. I knelt in the dirt, my hands careful as I pulled the bright green heads of lettuce from the soil, their leaves crisp and full. Ruth came out to help, her small hands clutching the edges of her dress as she watched me work. I handed her a basket and showed her how to pull the radishes, twisting gently so the roots came up clean. She giggled when the dirt clung to her fingers, her smile bright in the early light. We brought the basket inside, setting it on the kitchen table. I washed the dirt away, laying each vegetable out in neat rows. It is a small harvest, just enough for us, but there is satisfaction in it. I wrapped the lettuce in damp cloth and set it in the cold cellar. The radishes I sliced thin, adding them to the salad I made for lunch. Jakob nodded approvingly when he saw the table set, his hands still rough with dirt from the fields. He ate quietly, as he always does, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on the fresh greens. "It's a good start," he said simply, and I smiled back. June 3rd, haymaking begins. The days have grown longer, stretching warm sunlight across the fields from dawn to dusk. This morning, Jakob rose before the sun, his boots laced and hat pulled low. Haymaking begins today, and with it, the steady hum of work that fills the hours. I woke the children just after 5. Mary and Ruth rubbed the sleep from their eyes as I helped them dress. Breakfast was simple: scrambled eggs and fresh bread with a bit of butter and a dash of salt. Sitting to me seats, children ate quietly, their hands folded in prayer before each bite. Jakob finished his plate and nodded his thanks, heading out to the barn where the horses were already stamping their hooves in the early light. By mid-morning, the fields were alive with movement. Jakob and Isaac worked side by side, guiding the horses as they pulled the mower through the high grass. The steady rhythm of blades cutting through the stalks filled the air, blending with the soft whisper of the breeze. I watched from the kitchen window as the hay fell in neat rows, the grass lying flat and even under the sun's warmth. Mary and I spent the morning in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of peas and beans. Her hands are quick and capable now, her braids bouncing as she leaned over the soil. Ruth helped with the watering, her little hands clutching the tin watering can as she tipped it gently over the plants. In the afternoon, we carried jugs of water and fresh bread out to the field. Jakob Jacob stopped to take a long drink, wiping his brow with his sleeve. His hands were rough and stained with dust, but his eyes were bright. "Good day this year," he said quietly, and I nodded in agreement. June 16th. Canning begins. The first round of canning began this week. Mary and I spent the better part of the morning in the kitchen, our hands busy with rows of glass jars, metal lids, and steaming pots. We started with strawberry preserves, the berries fresh from Anna Miller's garden. She brought them by yesterday, her basket full and her cheeks flushed with sun. We washed the berries carefully, removing the stems and setting them in neat rows on the counter. Mary mashed them with slow, even strokes, her hands sticky with juice. I measured the sugar and set the pot to boil, the sweet scent of strawberries filling the kitchen. When the mixture was ready, I showed Mary how to pour it into the jars, her hands steady as she ladled the thick liquid carefully. We sealed them tightly and set them aside, their glass sides gleaming in the sunlight that stretched across the table. There is something satisfying in the work, the slow rhythm of it, the careful preservation of summer's sweetness for the colder months ahead. June 28th. A Sunday gathering. The community gathered today, as we do each Sunday, for worship and fellowship. We rode to the Yoder's farm. The children packed tightly in the back of the wagon, their hands folded neatly in their laps. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of fresh hay and blooming wildflowers. We sat in long rows in the Yoder's barn, the men on one side, the women on the other. The voices rose together in hymns, soft and steady, filling the space with gentle harmony. I closed my eyes as we sang, the familiar words settling around me like a warm blanket. After the service, the women set out long tables covered with cloths and baskets of food. Fresh bread, cheese, jars of jam, and bowls of fruit lined the tables, and the children gathered eagerly, their faces bright with laughter. I sat with Anna Miller, our hands busy with needlework as we spoke of the coming weeks, the garden, the harvest, the work yet to be done. The men lingered by the barn, their hands moving as they spoke of the fields, the weather, and the plans for the next harvest. Jacob stood among them, his posture relaxed, his smile soft as he listened and nodded. We left just before dusk, the sun stretching long shadows across the path as we made our way back to the inn. I washed the children, tucked them into bed, and sat by the window for a while, watching the fireflies blink along the edge of the field. The day was long, but there is a quiet satisfaction in the work and the gathering of friends. July 5th, corn harvest begins. The first of the corn was ready this week, its stalks tall and green, stretching high above the children's heads. Jacob hitched the horses at dawn, their breath visible in the cool morning air. I watched from the porch as he led them out to the field, their hooves pressing deep into the earth. Mary and I joined him after breakfast, our baskets in hand. The sun was already climbing high, casting warm light over the rows of corn that stretched out in neat lines. I showed Mary how to twist the ears from the stalks, her hands steady as she pulled them free. Ruth followed behind us, clutching a basket nearly half her size, her small hands clutching the handles with determination. By midday, the baskets were full, their edges brimming with bright yellow kernels. We took them inside, laying them out on the kitchen table. I showed Mary how to peel back the husks, her fingers working methodically, the silks piling up in soft heaps beside July 18th. Barn raising for the Millers. The Miller family needed a new barn, and the community gathered to help. Jakob left early, joining the other men as they set the posts and began the frame. I stayed behind with the children, baking bread and pies to bring for the midday meal. We rode out to the Millers just before noon, the wagon piled with food. The children nestled tightly together. When we arrived, the barn was already beginning to take shape, its beams stretching high against the sky. The men worked steadily, their hands moving with practiced precision, lifting and setting the wood in place. We spread blankets on the grass, setting out the bread, pies and jars of preserves. The men joined us in shifts, their faces flushed, hands streaked with sawdust. Jakob ate quietly beside me, nodding his thanks when I handed him a cup of cider. By late afternoon, the frame was complete, its edges sharp against the soft light of evening. August 2nd, preserving the summer harvest. The mornings are thick with warmth now, the sun rising earlier and lingering longer over the fields. The corn has been brought in, husked and stored away, but the tomatoes are coming in faster than I can pick them. This morning I woke Mary early, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and we went out to the garden, our baskets swaying against our hips as we walked. The plants were heavy with fruit, their branches bending under the weight of ripe red tomatoes. We worked in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a crow from the treetops. Mary picked steadily, her hands moving quickly, filling her basket before moving on to the next row. By mid-morning, the baskets were full and we carried them back to the kitchen. I set the largest pot I own on the stove, filling it with water to boil. Mary washed the tomatoes while I prepared the jars, setting them out in neat rows on the counter. We blanched and peeled them, the skins slipping off easily in our hands. The canning process took the better part of the day. By afternoon, the kitchen was filled with the rich scent of tomatoes simmering on the stove. We ladled the sauce into jars, sealed them tightly, and set them on the windowsill to cool. Mary watched them carefully, her eyes bright with pride as the lids popped softly, one after another. August 14th, a day of quilting. Today was the quilting circle at Anna Miller's house. I left early, just after breakfast, with my basket of fabric tucked under my arm. The morning air was cool, a thin layer of mist still clinging to the grass as I walked the path. When I arrived, the women were already there, their voices soft and steady as they spread the quilt across the wooden frame. It was beautiful, pale blues and creams stitched together in perfect squares. I settled in beside Anna, my hands moving with practiced ease as I threaded my needle. We spoke of the harvest, of the children, of the way the days were already growing shorter. Our hands worked steadily, the needles moving in and out of the fabric, binding the layers together. There is a comfort in it, the familiar rhythm, the soft murmur of conversation, the knowledge that each stitch brings us closer to completion. By late afternoon, the quilt was nearly finished. We folded it carefully, wrapping it in clean linen and setting it aside for the next gathering. Anna sent me home with a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from her oven, its crust golden and crisp. August 28th, evening by the fire. The evenings have grown softer, the light stretching out long and low over the fields. After supper tonight, Jakob lit a fire in the hearth, its warmth spreading slowly through the room. I settled into my chair by the window, my knitting resting in my lap, the yarn soft and smooth between my fingers. Mary and Ruth played quietly by the fire, their dolls cradled gently in their arms. Isaac and Samuel sat at the table, working quietly on their lessons, their heads bent low over their books. I watched them for a while, my hands stilling as I listened to the soft crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind against the window pane. Outside, the cicadas droned steadily, their song rising and falling with the breeze. I closed my eyes and listened, the rhythm familiar and comforting. It's a small life we lead, quiet and simple, but it is enough. September 4th, apple picking begins. The mornings are cooler now, the first hint of autumn slipping through the cracks in the window panes. Jakob brought the ladder out from the barn yesterday, setting it up beneath the apple trees that line the edge of our property. This morning we rose early, the children bundled in sweaters, their cheeks flushed with the morning chill. The trees were heavy with fruit, their branches bending under the weight of ripe apples. We worked slowly, plucking the reddest ones first, their skins smooth and cool against our palms. Ruth held the basket, her hands barely reaching around its handle, and followed us from tree to tree, her little steps careful and deliberate. We filled 4 baskets by midday, setting them in neat rows along the porch. I promised the children I would make an apple pie for supper, and their eyes brightened with excitement. After lunch, I set to work peeling and slicing, my hands moving steadily as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The pie went into the oven just as Jakob returned from the field, his hands rough and streaked with dirt. He nodded approvingly at the smell of cinnamon and apples drifting from the kitchen. We ate it warm, with fresh cream poured over each slice. The children licked their spoons clean, their cheeks flushed from the heat of the fire. Jakob leaned back in his chair, his hands folded over his stomach, his eyes soft with contentment. September 15th, first frost. The first frost came quietly, slipping in during the early hours of the morning. I woke to find the windows edged with silver, the grass stiff and white beneath the rising sun. The garden was still, the last of the beans and squash curled tight against the cold. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside, the boards of the porch creaking softly beneath my feet. Jakob was already in the barn, his voice soft as he murmured to the horses, their breath heavy and steaming in the chill. We gathered what was left of the harvest that morning, potatoes, carrots, and the last of the pumpkins. Mary and Isaac helped me pull the vines, their hands red and cold as they worked. We brushed the dirt from each vegetable, laying them in neat rows before carrying them down to the cellar. September 28th, preserving for winter. The days have grown shorter, the light fading earlier with each passing evening. I spent the better part of the afternoon in the kitchen, canning what we have harvested. The jars are lined neatly on the shelf now. Tomatoes, beans, applesauce, and pickled beets, their glass sides reflecting the soft glow of the firelight. Jakob helped me carry the last of the baskets to the root cellar. He moved with slow, deliberate steps, his hands steady as he placed each one in its place. We worked in silence, the only sound the soft brush of burlap against wood. When we finished, he rested his hand on my shoulder and nodded, his eyes meeting mine with quiet understanding. The work is hard, but it is good. It is ours. October. Gathering firewood. The leaves have begun to turn, their edges curling with hints of amber and red. The mornings are cooler now, the sunlight pale and stretched thin across the fields. Jakob rose before dawn to begin gathering firewood. He hitched the horses to the wagon and set out toward the edge of our property, where the oak and maple trees stand tall and strong. I woke the children just after 5, their cheeks still flushed from sleep as they pulled on their woolen sweaters. Breakfast was simple: porridge with cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Isaac finished his bowl quickly and joined Jacob by the barn, his footsteps soft against the frost-covered grass. By mid-morning, the first load of wood had been brought back and stacked neatly along the side of the house. Jacob showed Isaac how to split the logs, his hands moving steadily, the axe slicing cleanly through the wood. I watched from the kitchen window, my hands busy with bread dough, the flour soft against my palms. Mary helped me tidy the pantry, her hands quick as she wiped the shelves and arranged the jars of preserves. We spent the afternoon peeling apples for applesauce, our hands red and sticky as the scent of cinnamon filled the kitchen. By sunset, the shelves were full, the jars sealed tightly, their glass sides gleaming in the fading light. October 15. First frost and the quilting bee. The first true frost settled in last night, dusting the fields with silver and turning the edges of the grass brittle and white. I woke to the sound of ice cracking softly against the window panes, the sun just beginning to stretch across the horizon. Today was the quilting bee at Miriam Fisher's house. I bundled up the children and packed a basket of muffins, still warm from the oven. The walk was brisk, our breath rising in thin plumes as we followed the winding path to the Fisher's barn. Inside, the air was warm, the stove crackling with fresh logs, and the frame for the quilt set up near the window, where the light was best. We worked through the morning, our hands moving steadily, the needles slipping in and out of the fabric with quiet precision. The pattern was a simple one, patches of blue and grey stitched together with white thread. Anna Miller sat beside me, her hands as quick and sure as they have always been. We spoke quietly, our voices blending with the soft hum of conversation that filled the room. At midday, we took a break to eat. Slices of fresh bread, jars of jam, and cups of hot tea poured from heavy ceramic pots. The children played outside, their voices bright against the pale sky, their cheeks flushed from the cold. We watched them from the window, our hands wrapped around warm mugs, our laps still scattered with bits of thread and fabric. October 29th. Bringing in the pumpkins. The last of the pumpkins were brought in today. Jakob and Isaac went out before breakfast, their boots heavy with mud, their hands thick with gloves. I watched from the kitchen window as they pulled the orange globes from the vines, brushing off the dirt and setting them in the wagon. Mary helped me wipe them down and carry them to the cellar, her hands gentle as she set them in neat rows. I promised her we would bake a pie with the largest one, her eyes brightening at the thought. In the afternoon, I prepared the dough, rolling it out smooth, and even before setting it in the pan, Mary watched as I scooped out the pumpkin, her hands eager to help me mix the filling. By the time Jakob came in from the fields, the kitchen was filled with the warm scent scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. He nodded approvingly, his hands washing clean in the basin before he took his place at the table. We ate by lamplight, the room warm and bright, the pie steaming softly between us. November 5th, Butchering Day. The first snow came this morning, just a dusting across the ground, but enough to remind us that winter is close. Jacob spent the Monday morning sharpening his knives and setting up the table in the barn. Butchering Day is always hard work, but it is necessary for the long months ahead. Isaac helped his father, his hands steady as he passed tools and carried cuts of meat to the wooden table. I stayed in the kitchen, my hands busy with jars and spices, preparing to preserve the meat. Mary helped me grind the sausage, her hands moving rhythmically as the crank turned. I showed her how to pack the jars properly, making sure each lid was sealed tight. By late afternoon, the work was done, and the shelves were lined with jars of meat, their lids gleaming faintly in the low light. I wiped my hands on my apron and stood back to admire the rows of food, enough to see us through the winter months, enough to share if need be. November 12th, candle making. Today, Mary and I spent the afternoon making candles. The cellar is stocked with jars of wax left over from last season, and we melted it down slowly, the pot simmering gently on the stove. I showed her how to dip the wicks, her hands careful as she lowered them into the pot, lifted them and hung them to dry. The work is slow, each layer of wax building up gradually. Mary giggled when the first one dripped, the wax curling down her fingers. I laughed with her, our voices soft in the stillness of the kitchen. By the end of the day, we had made 24 candles, thick and sturdy, their wicks trimmed neatly. We set them on the table to cool, their edges still warm to the touch. November 28th, first real snowfall. The first real snow came last night, heavy and thick, blanketing the ground in white. I woke to the sound of the wind brushing against the shutters, the soft creak of the branches bending under the weight. Jacob was already at the barn, his footsteps trailing through the snow, deep and even. We spent the morning clearing the path, the children bundled in layers of wool and scarves. Ruth laughed as she tossed handfuls of snow at Isaac, her cheeks bright red with cold. Mary helped me sweep the porch, her hands red and raw from the chill. We worked until our breath came in soft clouds, our fingers stiff and numb. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and I set a pot of stew to simmer on the stove. The smell filled the room, rich and comforting. Jacob came in from the cold, his boots heavy with snow, his hands rough and cold. He sat by the fire, his eyes softening as the warmth spread through him. December 3rd, snowbound mornings. Winter has settled in fully now, wrapping the fields and the garden in thick layers of snow. Each morning, the windows are rimed with frost, the edges painted white with the touch of cold. Jacob rises before dawn, his breath visible in the air as he steps out to the barn. The horses nicker softly when they hear him approach, their breath heavy and warm in the chill of the morning. The children wake slowly, their faces flushed from the warmth of their quilts. Breakfast is hearty, oatmeal with honey, slices of fresh bread toasted over the fire, and mugs of hot tea. I pour cream from the jug, watching it swirl into the dark liquid, pale ribbons unfurling. Isaac helps Jacob carry wood from the shed, stacking it neatly by the stove, his hands red from the cold. The days are slower now, our work confined mostly to the indoors. Mary and I spend the morning sewing, our hands moving in gentle rhythm as we mend dresses and patch trousers. Ruth sits beside us, her small fingers working at the scraps of fabric I give her, tying them into knots and bits of ribbon. I watch her carefully, smiling as she frowns in concentration. December 14th, Baking Day. Today was baking day, and the kitchen was filled with the rich scent of bread and cinnamon. I woke early, just as the first light stretched across the snow-covered fields. The dough had risen nicely overnight, its surface smooth and plump beneath the cloth. Mary helped me shape the loaves, her hands dusted with flour, her braids falling over her shoulders as she worked. I showed her how to knead the dough properly, her hands pressing and folding in steady rhythm. We filled the oven with tray after tray, the warmth spreading through the kitchen, misting the windows with steam. By midday, the loaves were cooling on the counter, their tops golden and crisp. I set a fresh pie to bake, apple and cinnamon, with a lattice crust that Mary helped me weave. Ruth watched from her spot by the stove, her eyes wide as the crust bubbled and browned. We ate by the fire that evening, the pie still warm, the crust flaking beneath our forks. Jacob nodded approvingly, his hands cradling his cup of coffee as we shared a moment of silence. The only sound, the soft crackle of the fire and the wind whispering against the shutters. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The snow fell heavy last night, blanketing the fields and piling up along the edges of the barn. The sky was pale and soft this morning, the light stretching long and low over the trees. Inside, the house was warm with the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread. The children woke early, their eyes bright with excitement, their voices hushed in reverence. Mary helped me set the table, her hands careful as she laid out the cloth and the plates. I lit a candle in the centre, its flame flickering softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Jacob read from the Bible after breakfast, his voice steady and strong as the words filled the room. The children listened quietly, their hands folded neatly in their laps. When he finished, we sang a hymn, our voices blending softly in the stillness. There is a simplicity to it, a purity that I never tire of. In the afternoon, I took the children outside to gather pine branches. We brought them back and laid them along the mantel, their scent filling the room with the freshness of winter. I tied small red ribbons to the ends, Mary's hands helping me knot them just right. That evening we gathered by the fire, the room glowing softly with lamplight. We ate warm bread with apple preserves, the children's cheeks flushed from the fire. Jacob spoke quietly of the year behind us, of the blessings we have known, and of the hope that waits in the year to come. We went to bed early, the house settling into silence, the snow still falling softly against the window panes. January 2, the first morning of the new year. The snow lay heavy and untouched across the fields this morning, smooth and unbroken. I woke early before the children and pulled on my shawl, stepping out onto the porch. The air was sharp and clear, the sky stretched pale and wide above the trees. My breath puffed out in small clouds as I watched the light spread slowly over the snow, turning it to silver. joined me after a while, his boots crunching softly as he walked across the porch. We stood there together, watching the dawn creep over the horizon, saying nothing. Sometimes there are no words needed, just the quiet understanding of shared work and steady faith. January 11th, quilting by the fire. The days are short now, the sunlight fading quickly in the afternoon. I spend most of my time by the fire, my hands busy with the quilt I started in November. Mary sits with me sometimes, her small hands learning the stitches, her brow furrowed in concentration. I showed her how to keep the edges even, how to pull the thread tight enough without tearing the fabric. Her hands are clumsy still, but she learns quickly, her eyes bright with determination. We work mostly in silence. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of thread through cloth. Ruth plays quietly at our feet, her dolls wrapped in scraps of fabric, her voice soft as she whispers to them. I watch her sometimes, my hands pausing in their work, and I feel the warmth of gratitude settle over me. January 20th, ice on the river. Jacob and Isaac spent the morning checking the ice on the river. It is thickened enough to hold their weight, and Jacob is talking of cutting blocks to store in the ice house. He hitched the horses just after breakfast, their breath visible in the sharp morning air. I watched them from the kitchen window as they walked out to the edge of the water, their footsteps muffled by the snow. Mary and I worked in the kitchen, canning what was left of the applesauce. We heated the jars slowly, the steam rising from the pot, fogging the glass panes above the sink. I showed her how to ladle the sauce in carefully, leaving just enough room at the top before sealing the lids. She nodded as I spoke, her hands steady, her eyes focused. By evening, the jars were lined up neatly on the shelf, their sides gleaming in the lamplight. Jacob returned just before supper, his hands cold and raw from the wind. He nodded approvingly at the sight of the jars, his hands resting on my shoulders as he leaned in to look. February 4th, snowfall and stillness. The snow fell heavy last night, blanketing the fields in thick drifts that crept up against the barn and softened the edges of the fences. I woke to the silence of it, the world outside muffled under layers of white. Jacob was already up, his boots laced tight and his coat buttoned high as he headed out to check the barn. I woke the children just after dawn, their faces flushed from the warmth of their quilts. Breakfast was simple, warm porridge with cream and a bit of honey. Isaac shoveled the path from the house to the barn, his hands red and raw from the cold. Mary helped me sweep the kitchen, her hands quick and steady as she brushed away the bits of ash that had settled near the stove. The hard morning was spent in quiet work, mending clothes, scrubbing the floors, and checking the jars of preserves in the cellar. I showed Mary how to patch the elbows of Isaac's coat, her hands careful as she threaded the needle and pulled it through the thick fabric. She is learning quickly, her stitches neater with each attempt. February 16th, soap-making day. Today was soap-making day, one of the few tasks that fill the air with a crisp, clean scent, even in the dead of winter. Mary and I brought out the lye and the fat that had been rendered and stored since the butchering in November. We worked slowly, carefully measuring and stirring, our hands wrapped in cloth to protect them. The pot bubbled gently over the fire, steam curling up toward the ceiling. I stirred with a long wooden paddle, my hands sounds steady and rhythmic. Mary watched closely, her eyes sharp as I explained the process. Not too hot, not too cold, I told her, dipping my hand near the surface to feel the warmth. When the mixture was ready, we poured it into moulds, smoothing the tops with the edge of a spoon. The bars would need to set for a few weeks before they were ready to use, but there is comfort in knowing they will be there when spring comes, fresh and clean, ready for the first real wash of the season. February 28th, mending and preparation. The last of the heavy snows came last night, falling in thick flakes that drifted quietly against the shutters. I woke to find the world covered in white, the sky pale and stretched wide over the fields. Jakob left early to clear the path to the barn, his footsteps muffled beneath the drifts. Inside, I spent the morning mending clothes and preparing for our spring. Mary helped me sew new aprons for the girls, her stitches growing steadier with each line of thread. I laid out the seed catalogue on the kitchen table, running my fingers over the familiar pages. Corn, beans, lettuce, and squash. It would not be long now before the earth began to thaw, and the first sprouts would break through the soil. We spent the afternoon shelling dried beans from last year's harvest, setting them aside in jars to be planted when the time came. Isaac joined us, his hands moving quickly as he split the pods, the beans spilling out in neat little rows. Ruth watched quietly from her seat by the fire, her doll wrapped tightly in a patchwork blanket. March, Perth, thawing ground and hopeful days. The first hint of spring came today, a thin line of warmth stretching across the snow, turning it to slush along the edges of the path. Jakob noticed it first, his eyes scanning the fields as the frost began to lift from the soil. He came inside just after dawn, his boots heavy with mud, and nodded to me quietly. Won't be long now. I smiled back, feeling that familiar flutter of hope that comes with the first signs of thaw. We woke the children early, served them thick slices of bread with jam, and sent them out to clear the last of the snow from the garden paths. Their voices carried back to me through the open window, bright and cheerful, their hands busy with shovels and brushes. Mary helped me tidy the seed jars, her hands moving carefully as she arranged them in neat rows on the shelf. I showed her how to sort them by date, carrots and onions first, then beans and squash. Her eyes were bright as she listened, nodding thoughtfully as I explained the planting order. March 15th, preparing the garden beds. The snow has nearly melted now, leaving the ground dark and wet beneath our boots. Jakob hitched the horses early this morning and spent the better part of the day turning the soil. I watched from the porch, my hands wrapped tightly in my shawl, as the earth was broken up in neat, even rows. The children joined him after breakfast, their hands quick and eager as they picked rocks from the dirt and tossed them into the wagon. Isaac worked quietly beside his father, his movements deliberate and steady. Mary and Ruth followed behind, their dresses trailing in the mud as they worked. Inside, I prepared for the planting, sorting the seed packets, sharpening the hoes, and mending the baskets that would soon be filled with fresh vegetables. There is a comfort in the preparation, a sense of purpose that settles deep and sure. March 29th, first planting of the year. Today we planted the first of the peas and onions. The morning was cool and clear, the ground soft and already beneath our hands. Jacob and Isaac worked ahead, turning the soil in straight lines, their movements slow and steady. I knelt beside Mary, showing her how to press the seeds into the earth, her hands gentle and precise. Ruth followed behind with the watering can, her tiny hands gripping the handle tightly. She poured carefully, her eyes fixed on the soils. The water darkened it in soft patches. We worked quietly, the only sound the rustle of wind through the branches and the soft call of a dove somewhere near the edge of the field. When the planting was finished, we stood back and looked at the neat rows stretching out across the garden. "It's a good start," Jacob said quietly, his hands resting on his hips. I nodded, feeling the familiar swell of hope that comes with each new season. April 4th. Signs of new life. The sun has begun to stretch higher in the sky, melting the last patches of frost from the garden beds. This morning, I woke early, the light just beginning to spill across the fields, casting long shadows over the damp soil. Jacob had already left for the barn, his boots leaving faint impressions in the mud as he moved through his morning chores. I woke the children just after dawn, their eyes still heavy with sleep as they dressed by the light of the window. Breakfast was simple, fresh bread with butter and a bit of apple preserves from last fall. Mary helped me clear the table while Isaac and Samuel carried firewood from the shed to the back porch. We spent the morning in the garden, turning the soil and pulling away the dead leaves that had settled over the winter. Mary and I knelt in the dirt, our hands brushing the soft earth as we uncovered the first signs of green. The peas and onions we planted in March had sprouted, their tiny leaves stretching up toward the sunlight. Ruth watched with wide eyes, her small fingers brushing gently over the tips of the plants. April 12th, the first community gathering. Today was the first community gathering of the year, held at the Yoda's farm just past the creek. I packed a basket of fresh bread and jam, wrapping each loaf in cloth to keep it warm. We rode to the gathering just after sunrise, the children bundled in sweaters, their hands folded neatly in their laps as the wagon creaked along the path. The Yoda's barn was open, the long wooden tables already set with bowls of fresh fruit, jars of preserves, and slices of cheese. The women gathered near the hearth, their hands busy with quilting and mending, while the men stood in small groups outside, their voices low as they spoke of the planting season. I sat with Anna Miller, our hands working quietly as we stitched the edges of a new quilt for her youngest daughter. "She's to be married next year," Anna whispered, her eyes soft with pride. I smiled and nodded, feeling the warmth of community settle deep. The children played near the edge of the field, their laughter rising and falling like songbirds. Isaac and Samuel joined the others in a game of tag, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust as they ran. Ruth toddled after them, her giggles bright against the pale sky. When the sun began to set, we packed up our things, nodding farewells and offering blessings for the season to come. Jacobe's hand was firm on my shoulder as we climbed back into the wagon, his eyes bright with hope for the year ahead. April 21st, planting the root vegetables. The days have grown longer, the light lingering on the horizon well into the evening. This morning, we planted the potatoes and carrots. Jacob hitched the horses just after dawn, their breath visible in the cool morning air. I watched from the kitchen window as he led them out to the garden, their hooves roots pressing deep into the soil. Mary and I followed behind, our baskets filled with seed potatoes cut and ready for planting. I showed her how to set them in neat rows, her hands steady as she pressed them into the earth. Isaac worked with Jacob, his hands firm on the plough as they turned the soil in long straight lines. By midday, the potatoes were in the ground, their tops covered neatly with soil. We rested for a while, our backs against the fence, the sun warm on our faces. I passed out slices of bread and jars of fresh water, the children eating quietly, their hands smudged with dirt. When we finished, Jacob stood and dusted off his hands. "It's good soil this year," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the rows of freshly turned earth. I nodded, feeling the same sense of promise settle deep in my bones. May 3rd. Spring cleaning begins. With the warmer days, it was time for the annual spring cleaning. I woke Mary early, her eyes blinking sleepily as I set the buckets of water by the front door. Together, we scrubbed the floors, our hands moving in steady rhythm as the soap bubbled up beneath the brush. I took the quilts outside to air, hanging them on the line where the wind caught at the edges, snapping them gently. Mary helped me wash the windows, her small hands careful as she wiped away the dust that had settled over the winter. We beat the rugs in the back garden, dust rising in clouds that caught the sunlight, swirling before settling back to the earth. By afternoon, the house was fresh and clean, the windows clear, the floors polished. I opened the back door to let in the breeze, the scent of lavender and fresh earth drifting in. There is a satisfaction in the work, the feeling of renewal that comes with each sweep of the broom, each crack of the linens in the wind. May 15th, the first market day. The first market day of the year was today, held in the small clearing near the edge of the village. I packed a basket with fresh bread, jars of preserves, and a few bundles of herbs wrapped in twine. We left just after sunrise, the wagon rolling slowly along the dirt path. The market was lively, the stalls filled with early greens, baked goods, and handmade crafts. Mary walked beside me, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched the women barter and chat, their hands exchanging coins and goods. We sold most of our bread by midday, the jars of apple preserves following soon after. I bought a small bundle of rosemary and a sack of flour, nodding politely to Mrs. Weaver, who ran the stall. Her hands were steady as she measured out the ale flour, her eyes crinkling with a smile as she handed it to me. "Good year for planting," she said, and I nodded in agreement. May 28th, the garden in bloom. The garden is in full bloom now, the rows of lettuce and beans stretching out in even lines. The peas have climbed up their supports, their tendrils curling tightly around the wooden stakes. I knelt in the dirt this morning, my hands brushing aside the leaves to inspect the small pods that have begun to form. Ruth toddled beside me, her small hands reaching out to pluck at the grass. Mary helped me water the rows, her hands steady as she tipped the watering can just so. We worked quietly, the only sounds the whisper of wind through the trees and the soft hum of bees drifting from flower to flower. When the work was finished, we stood back and admired the garden. "It's good," Mary said quietly, her hands brushing the dirt from her skirt. I smiled and nodded, feeling the same sense of satisfaction settle in my chest. June 4th. of fresh hay. The fields are green and full, the garden heavy with new life. Jakob hitched the horses just after dawn, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Today was the first harvest of lettuce and spinach, the leaves thick and crisp beneath our hands. Mary and I worked side by side, our hands moving steadily as we pulled the greens from the soil, brushing away the dirt and laying them in neat piles. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the field, warming the backs of our necks as we worked. Jakob and Isaac spent the morning cutting hay, the steady rhythm of the scythe sweeping through the tall grass. The scent of it drifted through the garden, fresh and sweet, mingling with the salt of the sea air that sometimes crept up from the coast. By midday, the baskets were full, the leaves washed and bundled neatly on the porch. I set a pot of soup to simmer, its warmth filling the kitchen as the fire crackled quietly in the stove. We ate together at the table, our hands folded in prayer before each bite. June 20th, Summer Gathering. Yesterday was the community's summer gathering held at the miller's farm just past the river bend. I packed a basket with fresh bread, jars of peach preserves, and a still warm apple pie. Jakob drove the wagon slowly, the children sitting quietly in the back, their eyes bright with anticipation. When we arrived, the long tables were already set, covered with linens and lined with bowls of fresh vegetables, loaves of bread and steaming casseroles. The women bustled about, setting out pies and cakes, their voices soft and familiar. I sat with Anna Miller beneath the shade of an old oak, our hands busy with needlework as we spoke of the coming harvest. Her youngest toddled at her feet, his small hands clutching at her skirts. There is comfort in these moments, shared work, shared faith, and the steady hum of familiar voices. The men gathered by the barn, their hands rough with work, their eyes bright with conversation. Jakob stood among them, his posture relaxed, his voice low as they spoke of the coming wheat harvest and the condition of the horses. We left as the sun began to dip low in the sky, the children dozing in the back of the wagon, their cheeks flushed with warmth. Jakob's hand rested gently on my shoulder as we turned down the path, the shadows stretching long across the road. July 8th, the corn harvest begins. The corn grew tall and green this year, its stalks stretching high above our heads. Jakob hitched the horses at dawn, and by the time the sun was fully up, he and Isaac were already working their way through the rows. The sound of the blades cutting through the stalks drifted back to the house, steady and rhythmic. Mary and I followed behind, our baskets heavy with ears of corn, their husks crinkling beneath our hands. We worked quietly, our fingers moving, steadily as we stripped away the leaves, revealing the bright yellow kernels beneath. Ruth toddled alongside us, clutching a tiny ear of corn in her hands, her smile bright with pride. We filled the baskets by midday and brought them back to the kitchen. I showed Mary how to blanch the corn, dipping it into boiling water before setting it out to cool. The jars were lined up neatly on the counter, waiting to be filled and sealed for the colder months. By evening, the kitchen was heavy with the scent of sweet corn and fresh bread. We ate quietly, the light stretching long and low across the table, our hands folded in prayer. Jakob nodded approvingly, his eyes bright with satisfaction. July 25th, a year in reflection. The days are long and warm now, the sunlight stretching across the fields well into the evening. I sat by the garden this afternoon, my hands busy with the mending the children played near the edge of the fence, Jakob was in the barn, his voice low as he spoke to the horses, their hooves stamping softly against the wooden floor. It has been a year since I began this diary, a full circle of seasons, each bringing its own work, its own joy, its own quiet grace. I think back to last spring, the soil still hard with frost, the fields bare and waiting. Now the garden is full, the rows of peas and beans climbing high, their leaves brushing softly against the stakes. We have worked hard, but it is good. Work, the kind that settles deep in your bones and leaves you tired but satisfied at the end of each day. Jakob often says that the earth rewards those who are patient, those who wait and tend and trust in the turning of the seasons. I believe that too. July 31st. The cycle continues. This morning, the first hint of coolness slipped into the air, just enough to whisper of the fall to come. The children noticed it too. Mary looked up from the garden, her hands brushing the soil from her palms, and smiled softly. "It's changing," she said, her voice quiet but sure. I nodded, feeling that familiar ache of longing and peace that comes with the shifting of seasons. We will harvest more in the coming weeks. The squash, the pumpkins, the last of the beans. The canning will begin again, the cellar shelves filling with glass jars, each one a promise of provision through the colder months. I sat by the window after supper, the light stretching soft and golden across the fields. Jakob joined me after a while, his hands rough and calloused, his eyes soft as he looked out over the land. "It's been a good year," he said quietly, his voice steady and sure. "Yes," I replied, my hands resting on my lap. "It has." We sat together for a long time, the silence stretching out between us, comfortable and familiar. Outside, the cicadas droned softly, their rhythm slow and steady, matching the heartbeat of the land. The turning of the seasons. Another year will come, just as it always does. The soil will thaw. The seeds will be planted. The sun will stretch high above the fields, and the harvest will come. There is comfort in the cycle, the unchanging rhythm of the seasons that guides our hands and steadies our hearts. We will gather, we will work, and we will pray. Our hands will touch the earth, our voices will rise in song, and our children will grow strong and steady under the weight of good, honest work. And when the seasons turn again,